Poštovani gledalci, dobrodošli u još jedno izdanje emisije Granice Istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. U akademskim krugovima i javnoj sferi islamofobija se definiše kao oblik rasizma i ksenofobije, koji ne obuhvata samo precizno iskazan govor mržnje ili krivična djela počinjena iz mržnje prema muslimanima. Nasilje i netrpeljivost prema muslimanima kao vrhunac iskazivanja islamofobije su na samom kraju skale negativnog vrednovanja islama kao religije i muslimana kao sljedbenika te religije. Zbog toga se islamofobijom smatra i strukturna diskriminacija građana na osnovu pripadnosti islamu te širenje netrpeljivosti prema njima. Tome znatno doprinose negativne izjave te eksplicitni ili implicitni opisi islama i muslimana kao prijetnje određenoj kulturi ili vrijednostima. Kako pojasniti rastući trend islamofobije u Evropi i u kojoj mjeri muslimanski ekstremisti doprinose takvoj percepciji, analiziramo u današnjoj emisiji. Idemo sada do Strasbourga gdje se nalazi Daniel Holtgen, specijalni izaslanik Vijeća Evrope za antisemitizam i islamofobiju. Mr. Daniel, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Now, more than 20 years have passed since the 9/11 attacks on U.S. soil. Many Muslims, Islamophobia continues to haunt many Muslims living in the USA and in the European Union. Anti-Muslim hate crimes have spiked during the administration of former US President Donald Trump. How has the situation been in Europe over the past year?
Well, we've seen a rise again of anti-Muslim racism connected with the pandemic and connected with the spread of conspiracy theories online. This is a threat which is growing. It affects other communities as well. And it also affects anti-Semitism. And today we had the opportunity to present a new report by the Council of Europe, a recommendation, in fact, to all member states, how to stop and how to prevent this kind of anti-Muslim racism, which is a serious problem in many European societies. Muslims make up probably 5 to 6% of the European population, much more in certain countries. And the concept of anti-Muslim racism is no longer simply a construct, it's a reality. And if we see discrimination, stigmatization, and exclude Muslims from certain parts of the society, for example, in the workplace, then we have a problem. And this is what we wanted to tackle today with this report and our recommendation to governments.
What correlation do you see between Islamophobia and far-right extremism in the European Union? I mean, how do they impact one another?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head. It's still is, it always has been, far-right extremism, which is the main driver of anti-Muslim and also anti-Semitism in Europe. It has not stopped. It is still there. It raises its ugly face again and again. We have seen this in election campaigns. We have seen this in tendencies to criticize religious practices. And in fact, an important Jewish leader, the president of the European Conference of Rabbis, recently said much of the anti-Muslim sentiment in Europe today is also actually anti-Semitic. And Muslims face a double discrimination because of their religion, but also because they are amalgamated with migration. So people who are against migration blame Muslims, people blaming the pandemic take Muslims as those who are responsible. There is multiple discrimination against Muslims, but fortunately, some governments are taking very good initiatives, I think, to stop this trend.
Right. I mean, could you share with us some of these best practices that you have seen across Europe? I mean, what is the best way to battle rising Islamophobia and anti-Semitism?
The best way to fight this phenomena is, first of all, to realize that one has a problem and that it needs to be addressed, and not to ignore the problem. And this was the case in Germany when, after a major attack in 2020, which hit mainly Muslim people, 9 people died, the German government was persuaded by Muslim organizations to set up a commission to examine Islamophobia, or as we call it, anti-Muslim racism, to examine and to draw up recommendations. Today, we heard the representative of that expert commission speak. The report will be published next year. And this was really a government seeing that there was a problem and addressing the issue. My other recommendation is to support grassroots initiatives. So from the top level to the bottom level in the cities where we get these sort of conflicts. And I've seen many grassroots initiatives also of young Muslims getting together, speaking to their own community and making friendships with other communities, including the Jewish community. And we had a representative today of a French initiative which is doing just that. We need more young people to come together and to show that we can live together in diversity. And this is happening, and I want to get in a further stage many of these grassroots initiatives to exchange best practice. So top level and grassroots are what we need.
Right. France's separatism law, adopted last year, dramatically expands governmental powers to dissolve Muslim non-governmental organizations. We have seen the dissolution of 2 major Muslim NGOs back in 2020, including the CCIF. Why is the French state so determined to keep Muslim NGOs under tight control? I mean, even those that monitor Islamophobic attacks.
Okay, so here we're touching on the subject of fighting extremism. And I must say, I have not met a Muslim leader in Europe who denies that extremism is a problem and that it needs to be tackled. That's the first thing. Today, we had at least 2 speakers from France who were very clear, who said that Islam is entirely compatible with the Republican values. And we had representatives of the Muslim community here. So I think there may be a problem in interpretation and the wording. There was no criticism today of France and how France is addressing that problem. We did, however, identify that there is a problem sometimes within the Muslim representations, that they are diverse and they don't always speak with one voice. And this together, or this was one of the objectives today, to get Muslim organizations to be united and speak with one voice. That, I think, has been one of the problems in the past. But no criticism was voiced, and there was no indication that the French Republican values were in any way incompatible with Islam. Quite the contrary. It was a meeting of Muslims who were proud to be French, proud to be British, proud to be German, but also proud to be Muslims. And I think that was the way forward, to see each other as citizens of each other's countries and as European citizens, and to address this problem together.
Now, after a number of shooting rampages in Austria back in 2020, then Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz identified what he said was the ideological framework legitimizing such attacks. He blamed political Islam. However, he fell short of defining what political Islam was. But don't you think that Austria's and France's crusade against what they refer to as political Islam as part of a continuum of rather controversial policies that also include hijab bans and mosque closures is wrong and might eventually backfire?
Well, first of all, the Chancellor Kurz is no longer the Chancellor in Austria. And secondly, I think, again, the problem lies in the interpretation of certain concepts and wording. I know that many Muslim organizations don't like the expression political Islam. And if I were to draw an analogy, during the peace movement, many Christians took to the roads to demonstrate for peace, and we called it political Christianity. So in a positive sense. And so I think many find it disturbing that when Muslim citizens express themselves politically, that this is then automatically put into the extremist box. And I think that was part of the conference today, that we have to be careful. The vast majority of Muslims in Europe today are law-abiding citizens who just want to live in peace with their neighbors and practice their faith. The vast majority of Muslims are good citizens of their country, and we need more to come out to say that they are proud of their country and proud of being Muslims at the same time. And we need to counter the rhetoric that puts Muslims always in the corner of being extremists, because that simply isn't true. So it is true we also need to work on the wording.
Right, but do you consider the wearing of face veils or headscarves as a sign of political Islam?
Personally, I think wearing a face veil is a decision, or hijab is a decision that is made by individuals for very different reasons. But also some states have very, very clear laws which apply not only to the Muslim attire, Muslim clothing, but also to other religious groups. So one has to be careful that the same criteria are applied to all for different reasons. And we also have to recognize, for example, that in the French case, the ban on wearing religious symbols at public schools has been accepted as a principle also by the Court of Human Rights as something that can be done to balance certain interests. I personally think we also need to de-escalate this discussion, but at the end of the day, governments can take decisions in the interest of, for example, public schooling or other considerations. But there should not be a stigmatization of Muslims specifically and only of Muslims.
Right. Mr. Daniel Holtgen, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Naš naredni gost je Martjin de Koning, antropolog sa Univerziteta Radboud. Martjin, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Now, let me start by asking you, European governments consider the Salafi movement to be primarily a security threat in a way. Yet a lot of research has revealed that quietist and political Salafism in fact dominates this scene, and that they mostly distance themselves from coercion and violence in the European context, and very often also respect the secular nature and democratic authority. So let me put it very bluntly. Should anybody be scared of Salafis in Europe?
That's a great question. I think we should see the security question you're asking as one of the perspectives on Salafism. Another perspective is that it is a revitalization movement, revitalization trend within Islam that claims to follow the early generations of Islam, mostly focusing, a very conservative one, and mostly focusing on participation within particular limits in society, and shying away from politics, and definitely shying away from violence. The thing here is, and that really makes the question impossible to really answer very well, and the basic thing is that European governments have extended the idea of security in such a way that it not only includes political violence or a risk on political violence, but also matters of social cohesion, democracy, integration, and so on. So basically the whole concept of security has sort of colonized all kinds of other aspects of social life in Europe. What we see is indeed that Salafism is sort of the main target of countering violent extremism, countering extremism programs. On the one hand, makes it possible to sort of imagine where the threat comes from, and on the other hand also to distinguish between, let's say, good Islam, bad Islam, in order not to alienate other Muslim communities. So behind this question of Salafism as a security threat, there are all kinds of different problematizations going on.
Mm-hmm. Now, as you mentioned, when it comes to the securitization of Islam and Muslims, how have British, French, Dutch, German integration and countering violent extremism policies connected the idea of danger to Muslims and Islam? And what long-term repercussions will this have on the way Muslims live their lives and are perceived in Europe?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you. Basically, the idea that Islam is a potential danger is basically as old as Europe. One could even say that to a certain extent, it's one of the foundational ideas of Europe against Islam. More recently, in the last 40, 50 years or so in Western Europe, we have seen the issue of migration emerging as a security topic, Islam already being seen, conditionally being seen as a potential source of violence and conflicts in the 1970s. And it has been, in particular, the attacks in 2001 and the attacks in Madrid in 2004, and for the Netherlands, the murder on film director Theo van Gogh, that has turned this idea of Muslims as a potential risk into a sort of comprehensive counter-radicalization, counter-extremism policy, often focused not only on Muslims, but by very much emphasizing that the risk for political violence is located among Muslims, and then sort of taking the broader Muslim community as a community that needs to be monitored, that needs to be watched, that needs to be questioned in terms of security. So basically the counter-radicalization and the counter-extremism policies are building upon and reproducing the already existing connections in political thought, in representation between Muslims Muslims, Islam, and danger.
Right. So do you see a clear correlation between Salafism in Europe and Islamophobia in Europe? In other words, when Europeans think about Muslims, do they imagine, when they imagine Muslims, do Salafi Muslims come into their minds?
I think in many cases, and definitely, for example, if you look at Germany, the Netherlands, UK, France, also, I think the Salafi Muslims have become sort of the archetypal bad Muslims. Every Muslim considered to be problematic or potential danger is considered to be a Salafi Muslims, and vice versa. Salafi Muslims are seen as the quintessential danger to democracy and social cohesion. And that's sort of regardless of people's convictions, people's practices and beliefs, and so on. And there's really, I think, one of the major risks for the position of Muslims in Dutch society, because it sort of stigmatizes large sections of the Muslim communities, and the focus on Salafism, and for some broader on Islam as a security matter, legitimizes exceptional measures which could really damage the civil rights and the societal positions of Muslims. And we see that also, for example, among Muslims, so they do not want to be seen as a potential security problem because they fear they won't get a particular job they applied for. They fear they will get into trouble with the police, and so on. So yeah, that could really hinder people's position in society. And the whole idea of Salafism in that particular line of thinking has nothing to do, or not that much to do anymore, with people's practices and convictions, but has basically become a stigma to label the so-called bad Muslims.
Mm-hmm. When you talk about labeling or pigeonholing good Muslims and bad Muslims, do European governments, I mean, do they abuse their authority when it comes to, sticking these labels? And who exactly is? I mean, sometimes I have the feeling that, loyal Muslims are labeled as good Muslims. Those that may criticize the government are quite often pigeonholed into the archetypal bad Muslim group.
Yeah, clearly. Let me give you an example from the Netherlands. So the National Coordinator for Counterterrorism has asked municipalities to gather information about local Muslim communities, information that includes personal information of people, the different positions in networks, and so on. They do not have a legal jurisdiction to do so. Also, the municipalities do not have a legal jurisdiction to do so. Nevertheless, they did so, and partially they did it in secret. So not everyone who was sort of monitored and surveilled was aware that they became part of the research. What the government has now tried to do is not so much saying, okay, we're not going to do this anymore. No, they want to actually expand the legal jurisdiction of the national coordinator, so the national coordinator can do this. So yeah, I mean, that has really damaged the trust between some of the local Muslim communities and the local and national authorities, and also damaged the relationships of trust within the Muslim communities. And it's also a good example of the So the distinction between good and bad is, is a very unstable one.
Right.
And that you're once labeled a good Muslim does not mean that you do not become the target of government intervention, of government surveillance, and so on. It's basically creating the Muslim community as a whole as a suspect community.
Right. Martijn, it was a pleasure speaking to you. I'm afraid we'll have to end here. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Evropske političke stranke koriste diskurs islamofobije kao izborni adut ili za prikrivanje neuspjeha u rješavanju socijalnih ili ekonomskih problema s kojima se njihova društva susreću. Važno je imati na umu da kritikovati muslimane zbog zloupotrebe položaja ili korupcije nije islamofobija, ali tvrditi da je korupcija ili zloupotreba položaja ili političke moći ono što je muslimanima svojstveno jeste islamofobija. Poštovani gledalci, bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju emisije Granice Istoka. Ako ste propustili bilo koji dio, emisiju možete pregledati na našoj web stranici balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnji.